Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Author Scott Eyman and his book, Charlie Chaplin versus America. I loved this book. Love talking to Scott. Super interesting. This is one of those books. Oh, I'm not a history person. I don't read like. You'll still like this book. This book is great for everybody. And if you're not convinced by me right now, trust me, Scott's going to sell it to you over the next 40 minutes. So I guess I should just shut up and let him do that. Let's do it. And here we are with author Scott Eyman, Charlie Chaplin versus America, When Art, Sex, and Politics Collided. Scott, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it's good to be here, Brendan. Thanks for having me.
Now, Scott, you are not new to writing about kind of Hollywood legends and everything like that, but I have seen a couple places where you mentioned, like, this is the one. This is the one that you've been excited to write about for a very long time. What makes this subject so important to you?
Well, Charlie Chaplin was my entry drug to classic Hollywood, to old movies, to silent movies, which is where I basically started when I was 12 or 13 years old, and it kind of branched out from there. I bought an 8mm print of a Chaplin film called Easy Street that he made in 1916 or 1917 for $9.95, and just watched it over and over again in my bedroom on my little 8mm projector, trying to figure out how he did it. And I couldn't figure out how he did it. I could not see the transitions that he did between one mood and another, between one expression and another. It was just... I think I mentioned in the book, it was like he was like a world-class athlete, in that there was no barrier between what he wanted to do with his body and the expression of it. You know, they could just access it immediately. And another thing that interested me was the world the films took place in, you know, because it was a world completely different from the world I grew up in suburbia in Ohio. It was a world of immigrants. It was a world of poverty. It was a world of scraping by. And the faces were different. The clothes were different. The cars were different. Everything was different. It was like another world, except it was only actually about, 50 or 60 years before I started watching the movies. So it wasn't that far back in history as history goes. But it felt like you were going back to medieval times almost, and it just rang all the bells in my head that were waiting to be rung, essentially. And it started me off on the path that I've been on ever since. And I always loved Chaplin, but I never wrote about it because I didn't have, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of books about Charlie Chaplin. And I didn't see any particular angle that hadn't been exhausted, because certainly he's one of the most written about people in the 20th century who's not a politician. So I was sitting there, it was January 2020, and the world is closing down. The pandemic is starting, and I didn't know how long this was going to last. I had just shipped off the final version of a book I wrote on Cary Grant. Generally, I take, 8 months or a year off between books. But I thought maybe this is not the year to take off, because it felt like enforced vacation was bearing down upon all of us. So I figured, well, if I'm going to be housebound for a while, I better come up with something. Now, what can I do? Because all the libraries were closing too, and libraries are where, I do the bulk of my job. And I thought, well, what's digitized? What am I going to be able to access without leaving the house? Well, that narrows things considerably. And then I remembered the Chaplin archives were digitized. So I thought, okay, well, Chaplin, of course. I know a lot about Charlie Chaplin as it is, but I need a lot of new stuff. And where's my angle? And then just because I was thinking about Chaplin, seriously, for the first time in probably 30 years, it hit me that nobody had ever really gone into detail about the process by which the most famous comedian in the world had been banished from his adopted country. I mean, everybody referred to it, but nobody had gotten into it about, now, who pulled the trigger? Why did they pull the trigger? What led up to them pulling the trigger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Chaplin and Stay cleared their throat and thought about it for a while and finally said, okay, it sounds okay to us. So they gave me the password to the archive, the digital archive. And I started roaming around along with my researcher guy, Will Coates, who's a genius. And we found fascinating stuff. And that took 2 years. And then I sort of was nervously fiddling with my thumbs, waiting for the libraries to reopen, because I had to go to Library of Congress. There was the Nixon Library I needed to go to. There was the Truman Library that needed to be accessed. There were other libraries that I needed to access. And so more sitting around twiddling my thumbs, waiting for normalcy to return.
listen, everybody knows Chaplin, right? If I went, even, people who are not like tied into this stuff, they'll know who Charlie Chaplin is. They could pick the tramp out of a picture, right?
True.
And even for me, I'm not a cinephile, right? I've seen a lot of movies, but I don't get deep into it. I'm not kind of like the Tarantino type who wants to dig into it. But especially reading this book, he's so many different things at once. Like, I've read a lot of books that are biographies and things like that where it's, I want to show all the sides of this person. And you can say, well, they really weren't that. You had to kind of write that in there. It's amazing how many different things he was in one. Did you kind of have an understanding of that when you started to dig in, or were you learning a lot of stuff as you started researching?
On the one hand, I had read everything written in English almost on Charlie Chaplin. And there's some very good books on Chaplin. And I'd read all of them because I was always interested in him and because it's my field. And he's a primal figure in the history of American movies, in the history of world cinema, actually. I have a theory that Chaplin just might be the single most important figure in the promulgation of movies, because no one else at that period, in just before World War I, had access to the skills he had as an actor and the synchronicity with the audience that he had instantly without knowing it. He just showed up and the audience responded, and it was a world audience. So he suddenly made the world safe for movies in a way that no one else could have as quickly. And it was worldwide. And he combined all the components of the world audience, the swells who looked down on movies because it wasn't the theater and it was grimy and dirty and it only cost a nickel to get in, as well as the people who were thrilled because it only cost a nickel to get in. And they saw themselves reflected in the world Chaplin portrayed. So he put all the components of the audience together in one instantly, almost instantly. I knew a lot about him because I had talked to a number of people in the course of my career who had worked with him. His son, Sidney, I had a long interview with Sidney. Sidney was quite articulate about his father, who he loved, but who he saw clearly as a person. Jerry Epstein, who was Chaplin's assistant / producer in the last 3 pictures he made, Limelight, King of New York, and Accounts from Hong Kong, who was a member of the family, essentially. Claire Bloom, his co-star in Limelight. I talked to a lot of people over the years, and they all saw different facets at different times. What I came to realize in the course of writing the book and in the course of coalescing all the things I'd read and all the things I was finding out in the Chaplin archives and through the library work and through the conversations I'd had with people that knew him and loved him and were family members, was that he was basically, if you had to strip him down to one thing, he was a lone wolf because he had to be. Whatever his genetics were at birth, his utter and complete distrust of conventional society is reflected in every movie he made, because that was what his life was up until he got into show business at the age of 12 or so, 10, 12 years old. The poverty was overwhelming. The squalor was crushing. His father died of alcoholism at the age of 37. His mother went insane and had to be institutionalized. Chaplin was institutionalized in a workhouse for several years. And there were smaller institutionalizations for Chaplin in workhouses after that. For a time, he lived on the streets. So he experienced all the grimmest aspects of Dickensian England, the tenderest mercies of the social service industry in England at the time. And the brutality and the utter indifference of society at large. Although they pretended not to be indifferent, he understood what was really going on. So as he grew up, as he achieved some primacy first in the theater in vaudeville, and then in the movie business in Hollywood, he allowed very few people in. He did superficial intimacy very well. He could seduce anybody and think they were suddenly his very best friend, And 6 months or a year later, suddenly the phone wouldn't ring anymore. He wouldn't return your calls, There was never a break. There was never an argument. I think I mentioned at one point in the book, it was like he flipped through magazines, and when he was through with the magazine, he tossed it aside. He absorbed people, he got what he wanted out of them, and he moved on to the next person. The list of people he loved and was intimate with on an emotional level is very small. There was his brother, Sidney,
who he sometimes wouldn't even respond to for months, right?
Oh, that's because he didn't write letters. He hated writing letters. He just loathed writing letters. So Sidney, who loved writing letters, would constantly be nudging him, trying to get a response, because Sidney lived most of the time in the south of France, and Chaplin most of the time was in Hollywood. And all the communication was one way, unless Chaplin needed something. In which case, Sidney had to respond.
Right?
Right. It was a brother thing. his best friend was Douglas Fairbanks. When Fairbanks died in 1939, no one replaced him. He didn't have a best friend after that. That was his friend. That was the guy he could talk to and be intimate on an emotional level with, his best buddy. You know, they didn't go to ball games together. There wasn't that kind of friendship, but they both achieved a kind of worldwide fame that only someone else who had achieved worldwide fame could possibly relate to, you know? And there was his last wife, Una, who clearly he adored and never looked at another woman after he met her. And I don't think anybody that had ever known him would think that would ever happen.
Well, I mean, you also point this out too, though. All of that being true, there's plenty of instances where he might fire somebody, he might be done with somebody, but he'd know they're on hard times, and he'd keep them on the payroll even they may not be doing anything. Yeah. So there was this generosity to him in certain ways, but like you were saying, that intimacy, that was extremely rare for him.
Yeah. Oh, no, he would keep people on the payroll for years that no longer work for him. You know, old girlfriends, you know, old mistresses, but he wasn't talking to them. He was, you know, the check would be mailed to their home, you know, that kind of thing. It's not like they had a relationship. They had a relationship, but they no longer had a relationship. But he understood the indebtedness on some level, the emotional indebtedness. Maybe he felt he'd ill-used them. Who knows? You know, he was extremely loyal. People worked for him at his studio for 30 years, 40 years. And I mean, the pay scale was not high. It was not union level. You know, he never signed on to union level, but it was a guaranteed job. If you showed up, you had a job with him for life, basically. And when he left the country and he had to close the studio down, he pensioned everybody off. He gave very generous settlements to the people that had been with him, you know. And even though the magazines at the time said, no, he's cheap, he's thrifty, he's compulsively thrifty. Well, he wasn't. I wouldn't say he was tight. I'd say he was
frugal. Do we want to say frugal?
Sensitive. I would say he was sensitive about money.
Well, like you said, you know, when you start this, when you go back into his childhood, I mean, we are talking Oliver Twist type poverty.
Oh, yeah.
Which is, once again, that dichotomy of him, which is he is tight, right? He is the Hollywood archetype control freak. But then, as we're talking about, there's also this portion of like, just keep sending him a check. Like he's, and you say this, he was always afraid of being poor again. Like, it seems like everything in his head was always being poor again, but then it's somehow his thought process is still, but I can still give these people money, sometimes for doing absolutely nothing, except that they helped him once.
Yeah, exactly. It's a fascinating conundrum. But as his friend Max Eastman, who was friends with him for, you know, until he got kicked out of the country, basically. I don't think Eastman ever went to Switzerland to see him after Chaplin set up house there. But he said he was so much more conscious of the possibility of poverty than he was of the plethora of money that he actually had. Because he was extremely wealthy by the show business standards of that era. And he was extremely comfortable by the show business standards of our era, when there are much more avenues in which stars can cash in, you know? I mean, if you cease to be a movie star, you can still be a star on streaming. You can still be a star on Apple and Hulu and doing some second or third rate show, or go onto television. You know, there's just various levels of stardom. In Chaplin's day, there was only one. There was the movie business. And if you cease to be a star in the movie business, good luck. Because TV didn't arrive until the 1950s.
The other thing that just showing these two drastic sides of him, and I want to just sound like I'm an excellent researcher. I watched The Kid this morning, and I watched some of Limelight as well, is that he has this dim view of society, right? And we'll dig into, you know, especially how it kind of bites him later on. At the same time, whenever I've seen any of his films, the stuff that comes out is kind of his hopefulness, though. You know, the Limelight scene where the woman thinks she's not going to be able to dance again and everything. He talks about how wonderful life is and it's worth fighting for and things like that. Or The Great Dictator, where he makes his big speech, is that, especially when you look at the way he grew up, I don't understand how he had hope at all. Because especially starting and that developmental time in his life when he's young, it's just a nightmare, like you mentioned.
It is. But if he hadn't had that hope, he wouldn't have become what he became. He wouldn't have had the belief in himself. That never got leached out of him. The belief that I have something inside me that I have to express, and it's worth expressing. There's someone out there who'll be interested in this. Because when he went on stage, even as a young boy, he got a positive response. And what people didn't understand about him is that people thought he got weird because he got to be rich and famous. And there's those wonderful quotes in the book from Stan Laurel, who was his understudy in vaudeville, who said, people think he's strange now. He was strange then. He would show up 2 minutes before he was supposed to go on stage, and Laurel was all set to go on because where's Charlie? He's not here. Okay, Stan, get ready. And then he'd show up and saunter on and kill the audience, just to slay him. And there was no prep. There was no nervousness. He would just saunter into the theater. And he drove Laurel nuts, and he drove all the other comedians nuts because he was a man by himself. He was a lone wolf. He didn't hang out. He didn't go drinking because he had a horror of alcohol because of his father and because of all the squalor he'd witnessed as a young boy in Victorian London, when alcoholism was the prevailing discipline of the English music hall. His childhood formed him completely for good and for ill.
And it's strange, too. And just what you're saying, like right now, if you hear somebody in Hollywood doing that, that's like they're a diva, this is a power move. A lot of stuff just seemed to not occur to him. That, hey, if I'm going on in the last 2 minutes, people are going to freak out and all this stuff. It's almost like there's certain part. He had these big blind spots throughout his life. And what you're focusing on is when he gets exiled from the United States, it's not just this one thing that happened. It's that he's kind-hearted enough to go and talk about stuff, but he's also kind of too aloof to remember, hey, don't say this. This might bite you in the butt later, right?
No, it never occurred to him. It never occurred to him. One of the interesting things is, as I went through all the clippings, of the uproar after he got kicked out of the country, there were exactly 3 people in Hollywood who stood up for him. 3 who went on the record. Cary Grant, Sam Goldwyn, the director William Wyler. That was it. 3 people in all of Hollywood. Because most people in Hollywood didn't know him very well. He didn't show up at parties very much. He was not social, particularly. He played tennis he had a tennis court at his house on Summit Drive. And he played tennis. And if you played tennis, he would invite you to come over and play tennis with him because he liked to play tennis. That was his exercise. And occasionally he'd have a party, and people like Aldous Huxley would be there, and some of the German emigres who came over in the 30s to get away from Hitler and people like that. It was very kind of upper crust party. But he didn't go to Chasen's. He didn't do the Beverly Hills party thing. He just didn't show up at that stuff. So a lot of people didn't know him. They liked his pictures or they didn't like his pictures, depending. But it's not like he was part of the movie colony scene in any real way. He kept to himself because I don't think he trusted a lot of people. And he didn't need acceptance. There are a couple radio shows he did, but they were about politics in the 1940s. They were about politics. And he would do the BBC after he left America. He would do Desert Island Discs or something like that, when he was in London. But generally, he kept to himself. And that bit him on the ass, basically, when the wolves descended in the 1940s and into the 50s. It bit him on the ass because he'd been so isolated from the warp and woof. And when I call him the first independent filmmaker, and I refer to people like basically that Stanley Kubrick and Christopher Nolan and those occasional people who have popped up in cinema history, who kind of build an aura around themselves, a very remote kind of thing where they show up every 4 or 5 years with a movie, but you don't really see them or hear about them in between. And they have complete control and they do what they want to do. And there's a lot of uproar because of the lack of uproar, the conventional lack of conventional uproar. And they accrue power by isolation because they don't do all the conventional stuff. They're not doing that kind of trivial social intercourse that so much of the movie business and show business is about. That was Chaplin. Chaplin invented that role. The people call Orson Welles the first independent filmmaker. No, he wasn't. Orson Welles was an independent filmmaker because no studio would give him any money. He had to finance his own pictures by acting. Chaplin financed his own pictures because he'd made a lot of money as a producer and as a director and as an actor. Chaplin was the first independent filmmaker. He built his own studio on La Brea Avenue in 1918, for God's sakes. And he worked on that studio every day until he got kicked out of the country in 1952. And I have no doubt that he would have kept working there until he dropped dead.
This is what really blew my mind. If you ask somebody, oh, did you know Chaplin got, quasi-exiled? Yes. Yeah, he was a commie, right? And you kind of go back to this and listen, there were other components, but one of the big components is basically that too many times during World War II, he said, we have to help out our ally, Russia. Which, of course, us looking back, we know Stalin was a terrible person, all of that stuff. But right then, Hitler was the bad guy. And Chaplin always hated Hitler. You bring that out. But what came back to bite him was something that I think we would find completely innocuous, which is we have allies we need to make sure we support. And that's really what kind of came back years later. It's like, oh, he's a communist because of that. Now, here's the thing, though, when I read this too. Was it really about that? If it was just that, would this have happened? Or was it also his personal life, specifically his sex life? This was another one of those things that he didn't understand how to play the game as far as the publicity concerned and if people were talking to do it. If he didn't have all that, do you think this happens the same way, or do you think that was a big part of it?
You'd be foolish to think that sex was irrelevant. Jerry Epstein, his assistant, told me that Charlie never gossiped. He didn't care what other people did in bed or didn't do in bed. He had zero interest in other people's sex lives. He never gossiped about stuff. Well, that puts him on the fringe of human behavior because most people love to know what other people are doing, in bed or out. But he didn't care. He was just completely indifferent to that. And I think his natural assumption was, what business is it of theirs what I do? What business is it of theirs who I go out with? What business is it of anybody's who I sleep with? He didn't see that it was anybody's business. And his second wife was, I believe, 16 when they married, and she was pregnant at the time. And 18 was the age of consent in California at that time. So he knew very well he was playing with fire, and he didn't care. He just simply didn't care. Una O'Neill, his last wife, was 18 when they married, and he was 53, 54 when they married. And they were idyllically happy, had 8 children together. There were also any number of women who were age appropriate along the way. But it's foolish to think that that wasn't a deal, because when you plow through all the columns and all the editorials that were written about him from 1943 to 1953, 54, the aftermath of his banishment, the commie thing was part of it. And it was the blacklist era. Let's face it. He got caught up in the blacklist era. Would he have gotten banished if it hadn't been for his sex life? I kind of doubt it. Because after all the investigation, and the IRS went over him with a fine-tooth comb, and the FBI went over him with a fine-tooth comb, and Immigration and Naturalization, every government agency except the post office went over him with a fine-tooth comb. And they knew very early that A, he wasn't a communist, B, that he'd never donated $1 to the Communist Party, C, that he was basically an independent socialist / radical / free thinker, whatever you want to put on. He was just an outlier. And he was a lone wolf, as I keep saying. So he was a lone wolf politically. He didn't ascribe to any conventional wisdom. Even his loathing of Hitler, which began very early. The only people who wanted to make the great dictator were Charlie Chaplin and Franklin Roosevelt. Everybody in Hollywood thought he was absolutely insane. He starts shooting that picture in September 1939, when the American public and the American Congress is isolationist by a considerable margin. Hitler's not our problem. Hitler's Europe's problem. He's taken Italy. Yeah, fine. It's not our problem. Belgium, fine. France, fine. If he takes England, we'll cut a separate deal with it. And that was Joe Kennedy's ambassador to England. That was his opinion. The only 3 people who really understood who Hitler was and what he was about in the public sphere were Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Charlie Chaplin. And they all understood that you cannot make a deal with a lunatic. You cannot jolly a lunatic. He's a mad dog. He has to be put down. Well, Churchill and Roosevelt had one method of putting him down. Chaplin had another method entirely, which was ridicule. But Chaplin, in September 1939, the movie opens in October 1940. It's still an isolationist country. America's an isolationist country until Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And then suddenly, how dare he conquer Europe? How dare he think, even though it was the Japanese, they were allies. Well, Chaplin understood. He understood what Hitler was, but he didn't get a lot of points for prescience.
And the third prong of this attack on him, right? He's a communist, his sex life, and the third one, which I think you already explained, he never got American citizenship. And that was used against him, like, how dare he come here and make money, but not become one of us? Which, as we talked about, is like, probably just didn't occur to him. He just doesn't think that way.
Actually, I don't think that would be a problem today. I think that would be something that would kind of slide past. The politics thing would be a partial problem. The sex thing would be a big problem today because of the age of some of the women. But I actually don't think that would be much of a problem today. Because as Max Eastman, his friend, said, people don't understand Charlie. He was born in England, came to America, and made his fame and fortune here. If the reverse had been the case, if he'd been born in America, went to England and became rich and famous in England, he wouldn't have taken out English citizenship either. He didn't believe in national origin. He didn't believe in nationalism of any kind. He thought it was a toxic brew that resulted in National Socialism in Germany. They were all completely patriotic. They all thought Germany was, Hitler was the avatar of the restoration of German honor that had been destroyed in World War I. He thought patriotism was the last refuge of scoundrels. And he simply didn't. And he was happy. His sons fought in the American Army in World War II, both his sons, for Patton. They got out alive, which I think surprised him because he was terrified they were going to get killed. He didn't have a problem with that. He didn't have a problem with paying his taxes here. But he had a real problem with that kind of knee-jerk nationalism that was rampant after World War II.
All right, so a big question for you. What's his best movie? I'm making you pick one. You got to pick which one is the best one.
The one I think speaks most clearly to me as a comprehensive statement of who he was as a man, as an artist, is probably City Lights. I think for the general pop, it would be Modern Times. If you just want to introduce someone who's never seen Chaplin to Chaplin, I would show them Modern Times or The Kid. What do you think of The Kid?
I was shocked because I think when you think of Chaplin, you think of The Tramp, and then when you think of The Tramp, you think it's very funny. It's comedic. But especially watching it this morning, I'm like, there's some big stuff in here. There's some dramatic big stuff that, even today, you're like, hey, like they talk about this on TV. And then you're remembering, like, when he did this, even for The Kid, there was a lot of stuff that was very much on the line as far as morals, what you can talk about, what you can show in the movie. I was really interested. I watched it, and then I just read a couple of reviews of it from that time. And one of them just kept going like, listen, it's a masterpiece, but he's very vulgar. You forget, unless you've seen them, that he was funny, but there's also drama in everything that he was doing. And another thing you talk about too, you forget that the music is there too. His silent films, the music is a huge part of it, and it feels very well done as opposed to just something in the background. I think The Kid is kind of perfect as far as who is he, why does people remember him? But like you said, like City Lights is something where this is everything he can do. He can put that all in there, and that's where him at all of his powers and using them all, I think it's kind of City Lights. My next question for you, though, would be, I'm not going to say what's his worst movie. I'm going to ask, do you think any of his movies were a mistake?
I think Monsieur Verdoux was the wrong movie at the wrong time for the wrong audience because it was released in 1947 and he had gone through years of abuse in the press about A, his politics, and B, his sex life. And here he is doing a movie about a guy who marries and murders women for their money, basically confirming his public image, the image that had come to be accepted as the truth, as a misogynist. And it was his first commercial flop, and it was a huge critical flop. It did well in Europe, of course it would, but in America, it dropped dead. And I'm sure it was a real body blow to him, because for the first time, he had lost the audience. Even The Great Dictator had been extraordinarily successful commercially and critically to a great extent. He made a lot of money on The Great Dictator, and everybody told him he was crazy. So it had confirmed him in his own feelings that I know what I'm doing. The public will follow me where I take them. And then he makes Monsieur Verdoux, and the public said, nah, I don't think so. They just didn't go, and the critics hated the picture too. And at that point, I'm sure he thought, things have changed, to quote Bob Dylan. Things have changed.
And now we talked about this, you've written a lot of books on Hollywood icons. Do you see any through line with Charlie Chaplin and some of these other books you've read? Are they all kind of different? Does Chaplin stand out in a particular way, either as kind of the first or, the biggest weirdo or the first real total control freak? Do you see any similarities when you look at these people?
The only corollary to Chaplin in my work that I can think of is Cary Grant, because they were both English. They both had miserable childhoods, although Grant never had to worry about his meal, where his next meal was coming from. Chaplin did. Grant was lower middle class, but not poverty stricken. But in both cases, people assumed that what they saw on the screen was the person, and it wasn't the person. The character Cary Grant played was a construct put together incrementally over a period of years. The character Chaplin played was a construct Now, there was an overlap between the actor and the creation. More of an overlap, I think, in Chaplin's case than in Cary Grant's case, who was not particularly charming, who was actually kind of nervous and pettish and paranoid about money in a way that Chaplin wasn't particularly. Chaplin was economical, but he wasn't paranoid. Cary Grant was kind of paranoid about money. But there were some similarities there in terms of a lack of social skills as children and lack of nurturing as children that very much affected their adult lives.
Is it possible to overstate how important Charlie Chaplin is to movies? I know you kind of said this at the beginning, but I want to give you a chance to really answer this specifically. Is it possible to overstate how important he is to the movies?
No, because is it Karl Marx who said something about seizing the means of production? Because that's what Chaplin did. He seized the means of production immediately because he starts work at Keystone in December of 1913. And within like a month or two, he's agitating to direct. Now, who does that?
Egomaniacs, that's who. And control freaks.
Yeah, but he was onto something, and he understood that no one could communicate what he was onto but him. He needed to take the means of production into his hands. And the Senate got so sick of being harassed by him, they said, okay. But if you direct the movie and I can't release it, you're going to have to pay me for it. And Chaplin agreed that he would reimburse Senate if the film was unreleasable. And he started directing, and he directed everything he made after that. But that's like within 2 months. Who does that? What actor on their first job in the movie business starts giving the producer a hard time about wanting to direct?
Well, hold on. I'm going to cut you off there. I think there's probably plenty who would, because that's just Hollywood. Whether or not they could actually succeed like Chaplin, I think is the bigger question after that.
But he grabs the means of production and he never lets go. He forms his own film company, which is extremely successful. He forms United Artists. And the whole point of United Artists was making sure that the artist who puts up all the people who formed United Artists, Douglas Fairbanks, Griffith, Mary Pickford, and Chaplin, financed their own pictures. And in return, they got 70% of the proceeds. In other words, they weren't salaried. They weren't working for anybody but themselves. In return for assuming the financial risk. Okay, fair enough. So they were leading the way in a way that nobody really has since. Even Kubrick took Warner Brothers' money.
How nice of him.
Christopher Nolan takes Universal's money. They're not financing their own movies. They're not stupid. But Chaplin financed his own movies at considerable risk in the case of The Great Dictator, and making a silent movie like Modern Times in 1936, when everybody also thought he was crazy because silent movies were dead. And it's 1936, and silent movies have been dead since 1927. What's he doing? And it was a huge hit. The audience followed him where he went. And as I said, in 1914, 1915, 1916, he created a tsunami of interest in the movie business because he was the focal point of the American movie business. He became the focal point of the American movie business by taking control, by building his own studio, by the character of the tramp, which cascaded across the world because the English saw the tramp as English, which he essentially was. It's an English idea, this dignified poverty thing that is the basis of the tramp, much more so than in America. But he took America. The French saw him as French. The Germans saw him as German. The Japanese saw him as Japanese. Nobody else could do that. Harold Lloyd was profoundly American. Buster Keaton was profoundly Buster Keaton. He's not American. He's not French. He's just Buster Keaton. But Chaplin was taken as a citizen of the world, which is what he thought of himself as intellectually. I think if you start with Chaplin, and you won't go far wrong as the progenitor of what we think of as modern movie stardom.
Scott, 2 more questions. Number 1, who was his best leading lady? Your opinion, who was his best leading lady?
Paulette Goddard in Modern Times.
See, that one was easy one. Let's go to the last one. All right. Listen, there are horribly misguided people out there who say, I don't read nonfiction, history stuff. It's boring. That's a class I took in high school. I don't do that anymore, right? If I can get one of those poor souls, sit them in front of you, and they said, why should I read Charlie Chaplin versus America? What would you say to them?
Because it'll help you understand show business and it will help you understand American politics, which haven't changed at all.
Too easy. Listen, Scott, I love the book. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Brendan. It's been a pleasure.
And that's it for this episode. Scott, thank you so much for coming on. Charlie Chaplin versus America. Seriously, go out and get it, folks. Great read for everybody. Not making it up. In the meantime, hit us up, Twitter, not calling it X, Facebook, Instagram, hit up the blog, leave us reviews, send us emails. You can do that right through the website. We'd love to hear from you, and we will get back to you. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.